Picture this. You're flying in a tiny plane over the endless, golden brown desert of southern Peru. Down below, it just looks like an empty, sweeping landscape fading into the hazy mountains. But then, you look a little closer, and out of the dust, these completely impossible shapes start to appear. First, you spot a massive hummingbird, looking like it's frozen mid-flight. Then, a giant spider. Next, a monkey with this huge, spiraling tail. And cutting right through all of it are these enormous, perfectly straight lines stretching for literally miles. Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unraveling one of the most fascinating puzzles in human history, the Nazca civilization. It's the kind of question that just grabs you, right? I mean, these are the world-famous Nazca lines. But seriously, why would an ancient group of people spend countless hours and a staggering amount of physical effort carving these colossal animals in geometric shapes into the dirt? Especially when you can barely even tell what they are from the ground. It's a massive mystery. To really get to the bottom of it, we have to look past the lines themselves and meet the actual people who drew them. The Nazca were an incredible society, and they were thriving in one of the absolute harshest, most unforgiving environments on the entire planet. To wrap our heads around the Nazca, we really have to understand the wild extremes of their world. On one hand, you've got the barren coastal desert. We are talking about a fiercely dry landscape, just baked by a relentless sun, getting almost zero rainfall all year round. It's the kind of place that seems totally hostile to human life. But then, flip the coin, and you have these narrow, super fertile river valleys. These were literal lifelines, veins of water flowing down from the towering Andes Mountains, carving these beautiful bright green ribbons right through the endless brown of the desert. Okay, let's dive into this. Because when you look at that extreme environment, the biggest question isn't actually how they built the lines. It's how did a civilization survive here at all? The answer? Incredible, mind-blowing ingenuity. Human settlement, agriculture, and just plain daily survival here depended entirely on masterful water management. Without those rivers and without meticulously engineered irrigation, trying to farm or feed a large population in this region would have been absolutely impossible. For the Nazca, water wasn't just another resource. It was the absolute center of their entire existence. And it's really important to remember that the Nazca didn't just magically appear out of thin air. History doesn't usually work like that. Their culture actually emerged in the first centuries BCE, descending directly from earlier coastal cultures, especially the Paracas tradition. The Nazca took the artistic, religious, and agricultural foundations laid by their ancestors and just brilliantly transformed them. They really hit their stride and peaked during the first few centuries CE, creating the masterpieces we know today, before they eventually ran into some intense environmental stress that would change their society forever. So, what did their daily world actually look like? Well, those Nazca valleys were bursting with life. We're talking thriving agricultural fields, churning out crops like maize, squash, and beans, all fed by complex irrigation channels engineered to catch that precious mountain runoff. Their towns had bustling artisan workshops, churning out incredible goods, alongside deeply sacred ceremonial areas and massive cemeteries. So when we picture the Nazca, forget the empty desert stereotype. We really need to picture a vibrant network of green valleys where farmers, weavers, and potters lived super dynamic, full lives. But of course, we can't ignore their most famous legacy. We all know the word geoglyph, arranging earth and stone to make massive ground designs. But here's a fun fact. While the animals get all the glory, the hummingbird, the condor, the spider, the vast majority of the Nazca creations were actually massive straight lines, sweeping trapezoids, and intricate geometric forms that crisscross the desert floor like some giant, baffling blueprint. So how on earth were they created? Well, despite what late-night TV might try to tell you, it wasn't ancient aliens, and no, these were not landing strips for spaceships. It was brilliant, highly methodical human engineering, and the process itself was shockingly simple. They just removed the darker, sun-baked surface stones to expose the lighter-colored, sandy ground underneath. Then, using nothing but wooden stakes, long ropes, careful measuring, and a whole lot of planning, human hands laid out remarkably straight lines over vast, vast distances. It was a simple technique, sure, but it took an immense amount of coordination. The real reason we can still see them today is actually thanks to the very environment that made living there so tough. The extreme, windless, completely rainless climate of the Peruvian desert basically froze these geoglyphs in time, preserving this ancient engineering for well over a millennium. Now, you might have heard of the famous researcher Maria Reich, and while she played an absolutely monumental role in documenting, mapping, and fiercely protecting these lines from modern destruction, we should note that she didn't actually discover them. The local Peruvian communities, they always knew these incredible etchings were out there. Okay, so we know how they were made, we know who made them, but that circles us right back to the biggest, most captivating question of the whole shebang. Why build them? What was the actual point of moving millions of stones to draw massive figures and lines across a scorching desert? Archaeologists have spent decades scouring the region to figure this out, and they've come up with several really strong evidence-based interpretations. It's highly likely these were ritual pathways, literally meant to be walked upon during ceremonies. Think of them as massive open-air ceremonial spaces. Many researchers point heavily to water-related rituals, too, essentially using the lines as massive prayers to the gods for rain. They could have also mapped out pilgrimage routes, connecting sacred spots across the landscape. The reality is, just like the buildings in our cities serve different purposes, there probably wasn't just one single universal reason for every line. Different shapes and different animals likely served totally different social and religious functions for the community. And this perfectly highlights the deep connection between their rituals and their day-to-day survival. Enter the Puquios. These are incredible underground or partially underground spiraling water channels found in parts of southern Peru. Now, archaeologists are still actively debating the precise dating and development history of every single one of these Puquios, but they stand as a stunning testament to how vital water really was. Finding and directing underground water was central to keeping the community alive, making it undeniably central to their religious beliefs and, by extension, those massive geoglyphs they carved into the earth. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it completely flips our perspective. We are so incredibly used to seeing the Nazca through the lens of those vast, muted, sort of monochromatic desert lines. But when archaeologists look at the Nazca, they look at something entirely different. They're incredibly vibrant, colorful, and hyper-detailed artifacts. To truly understand these people, we have to look at what they held in their hands, not just what they drew on the ground. Because here's the thing. The Nazca didn't leave us a conventional written history. There are no books, no scrolls, no carved stone texts. So their artistic record is literally everything. It is their voice. They left behind brilliantly colored polychrome ceramics, painted with just an astonishing array of pigments. They wove intricate, symbol-rich textiles that are absolute masterpieces of ancient craftsmanship. And looking closely at this art, we see complex supernatural beings, vivid plants, animals, and some really strange hybrid figures. Archaeologists actually track changes in these pottery styles to decipher the different phases of Nazca culture, how their beliefs shifted, and what their daily routines looked like. Digging into that archaeological record also reveals some pretty intense, highly debated practices, specifically the mystery of modified human heads found at Nazca sites. These so-called trophy heads show up in the physical archaeological record and all over their art. But what do they actually mean? Were they the grim results of brutal warfare? Were they part of solemn ritual sacrifices? Could they be linked to complex ancestor practices, or were they maybe expressions of social and political power? While researchers are still hashing out the exact meaning, it proves one thing for sure. The Nazca possessed a deeply complex and sometimes fierce spiritual worldview. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that we have to ground our understanding of the Nazca in their humanity. They weren't mystical magicians, and they weren't some one-dimensional society obsessed only with drawing lines in the dirt. The real Nazca were a deeply complex, highly specialized society. They were farmers tending their crops, potters mixing pigments, master weavers at their looms, traders, builders, parents, and children. Those enigmatic lines out in the desert were just one piece. A spectacular piece, sure, but still just one piece of a very rich, full society. But as we all know, no civilization lasts forever, and survival in the desert is a very delicate balancing act. Just like the quote on screen suggests, the stones remained, but the society itself entered a period of profound change. Over time, the Nazca world faced an increasing, almost insurmountable threat. The climate began to shift. Prolonged droughts and severe climate variability started putting intense environmental pressure on those once fertile valleys. The landscape could only support these thriving communities as long as the rivers and agricultural systems remained reliable. Which leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question. What happens when a civilization built entirely around the precise control of water begins to lose that very water? Do they adapt? Do they fight? Do they simply pack up and abandon the valleys they called home for centuries? The massive desert animals are completely silent on the matter, but the artifacts aren't. In part 2 of this explainer, we're going to follow the evidence right into the final, tumultuous centuries of Nazca society. We'll uncover the cascading factors that caused their decline and answer, once and for all, what truly happened to the people behind the lines. You definitely won't want to miss it.
Picture this. The sun is just starting to peek over the rugged, harsh desert of southern Peru. As the light hits the ground, it reveals these absolutely massive shapes carved right into the earth. We're talking a giant hummingbird, a monkey, and these impossibly straight lines that literally just vanish into the horizon. It's breathtaking. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to tackle one of history's absolute greatest archaeological puzzles. But instead of just staring at the famous Nazca lines themselves, we're shifting our focus to the mysterious people who actually built them.
Okay, let's dive into this because the central question we are investigating today is a really profound one. What actually happened to the folks who created these famous lines? It's this wild mystery that has kept researchers up at night for decades. I mean, the geoglyphs are totally iconic, right? But the architects behind them, they seemingly just vanished into the desert sands. So to figure out if they truly disappeared like ghosts, we have to look way past the popular myths and dig directly into the hard archaeological evidence. Now, to really understand these people, we have to understand their reality. And let me tell you, their reality was harsh. The ancient Nazca heartland wasn't exactly what you'd call a forgiving place to set up a civilization. It was an extreme, bone-dry desert environment. For these communities to just survive, let alone thrive, they had to pull off this incredible high-stakes balancing act. They relied heavily on incredibly sophisticated irrigation systems just to capture the scarce, tiny bits of river runoff trickling down from the Andes Mountains. And this brilliantly illustrates what happens when that super delicate balance shatters. Environmental reconstructions show us this devastating domino effect triggered by prolonged droughts. You know, it's like a chain reaction. It starts simply enough, less rainfall means smaller harvests. But those shrinking harvests, they quickly spiral into severe food shortages. Hunger kicks in, and that fuels some really intense competition among communities for whatever precious resources are left. Ultimately, all of this totally destabilizes their entire political and religious foundation.
But it is vital to realize that this wasn't some sudden, overnight catastrophe. It wasn't like a volcano erupting or a massive earthquake. The clues left behind in the desert environment, like in ancient horongo trees and fossilized plants, they tell a much more nuanced story. We're looking at changing rainfall patterns and climate shifts that played out over centuries. Archaeologists can literally read the dirt to see how human agriculture was constantly, stubbornly trying to adapt to the retreating natural vegetation. It was just a really slow-motion struggle against a constantly shifting landscape. Here's the thing, though. Intense environmental pressure doesn't automatically equal the end of a civilization. Societies adapt, right? And instead of just collapsing, the Nazca completely transformed. They started shifting their settlement patterns, abandoning their old homes, and completely reorganizing their regional power centers. They even forged totally new, evolving trade networks. Sure, as resources dried up, localized warfare and competition naturally flared up. But honestly, it's a fascinating testament to human resilience. They didn't just throw their hands up and quit. They adapted in these huge, complex waves across the entire region.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it tackles one of the most stubborn misconceptions out there. We've all seen the pop culture myth, right? The whole idea that the Nazca lines were these ancient airports or runways built for extraterrestrials. Well, the archaeological reality is actually so much more impressive. There is absolutely zero credible evidence for aliens, none. These geoglyphs were carved entirely by ancient human hands, using really basic standard tools. The fact that actual people achieved this mind-blowing scale without any modern technology, to me, that is vastly more fascinating than any sci-fi myth.
So, if they weren't ancient runways for UFOs, what on earth were they? Well, the evidence points to them being massive ceremonial pathways. These geoglyphs were likely designed for these grand, elaborate rituals tied to water, fertility, and honoring the surrounding mountains. And here is the absolutely crucial part. They were meant to be experienced entirely from the ground level. You didn't need to fly in a spaceship to see them. Entire communities would walk directly along these lines in grand processions. Imagine the immense devotion and the incredible social organization it took just to pull that off.
Let's move to and see how this builds a crucial historical correction. The Nazca people never just vanished into thin air. Instead, if we look at the timeline, we see this beautiful continuous progression. The classic Nazca culture endured generations of brutal environmental stress, which forced a period of intense cultural adaptation.
And that adaptation? It eventually paved the exact way for the rise of the Wari influence, which then led straight to the emergence of completely new Andean societies. It's all connected.
And that Wari influence is where the story takes a really fascinating turn. During the first millennium CE, this distinct cultural network started expanding across the Andes. But it wasn't some violent overnight military conquest, not at all. It was more of a gradual blending. The descendants of the very people who built the Nazca lines, they just continued living there. And through decades of trade, migration, and adopting new cultural practices, they seamlessly, naturally integrated into these much wider Andean networks.
Now, I have to mention, we wouldn't even be able to piece this complex, amazing history together today if it weren't for the absolute dedication of modern explorers, most notably a woman named Maria Reiche. While the local people always knew the lines were there, Reiche dedicated decades of her actual life to systematically mapping and protecting this site. When you combine her absolute obsession with the advent of modern aerial photography, which, by the way, finally revealed the true, breathtaking scale of the desert, she is basically the main reason this archaeological wonder survived into our modern era for us to even analyze.
However, that survival is far from guaranteed moving forward. Today, these ancient marvels are incredibly vulnerable to modern threats. We're talking about expanding urban development, off-road vehicles just carelessly tearing across the fragile desert floor, harsh climate changes, and natural soil erosion. They are all putting these lines at massive risk. And here's exactly why this matters for us. We can only solve the historical mysteries of our past if we actively protect the physical landscapes right now in our present. If you erase the lines, you literally erase the story of the people who walked them.
So, the crucial point is this. The Nazca didn't vanish. Their civilization simply adapted to centuries of shifting climates and shifting power dynamics. Yet, a deeper mystery still lies right beneath our feet. Were these breathtaking geoglyphs just pathways, sacred landscapes, or maybe a message still waiting to be completely understood? They left us no written chronicle. Instead, they boldly wrote their story across the harsh desert itself. Why did these specific shapes matter so deeply to the resilient people who struggled here? Well, for over 1,000 years, the desert has preserved their secrets and their questions. Keep questioning history, and I'll see you in the next explainer.